Entire societies have vanished from our collective memory. This video uncovers 20 cataclysmic events that erased civilizations from the Earth, revealing how powerful natural forces and human fragility conspire to wipe cultures from the map. You will gain a new perspective on history, understanding the delicate threads that hold our own world together. We will explore why a volcanic eruption can silence a maritime empire and how a prolonged drought can topple a vast kingdom. What forgotten story of collapse resonates most with you today? A society's collapse often begins not with a bang, but with a slow unraveling of the systems that hold it together. Think of a civilization as a towering structure built from countless interconnected parts. There is the agricultural foundation that feeds the population. There are the trade routes that bring in essential resources, and there are the complex social and political institutions that manage it all. Historians like Joseph Tainter argue that this very complexity becomes a vulnerability. Each layer of administration, each new technology requires more energy to sustain. For a time, the benefits outweigh the costs, but when a crisis hits, whether a prolonged drought or a sudden volcanic winter, the entire structure can buckle under its own weight. Trade networks shatter, leaving cities starved for materials. Agricultural systems fail, leading to famine and social unrest. Specialized knowledge, from metalworking to writing, can be lost in just a generation if there is no one left to teach it. This domino effect doesn't just topple a government, it can erase a people's entire identity from the Earth's memory, leaving behind only whispers in the dust for us to decipher. This pattern of systemic failure sets the stage for our first cataclysmic event, a disaster so profound it silenced a powerful maritime empire for over 3,000 years. The vibrant world of the Minoans was extinguished in a geological heartbeat. On the island of Thera, a volcano exploded with a force that defies comprehension, one of the most powerful eruptions in the last 10,000 years. This was not a single disaster but a cascade of catastrophes. First, a towering column of ash and pumice darkened the sky, burying the thriving city of Akrotiri under meters of volcanic debris. Then the emptied magma chamber collapsed into the sea, triggering tsunamis of staggering height. These walls of water raced across the Aegean, slamming into the northern coast of Crete, the very heart of the Minoan Empire. Their magnificent ports, the source of their maritime power, were utterly demolished. The tsunamis swept inland, flooding fertile coastal plains and salinating the soil. The ash fall that followed choked the remaining farmland, leading to widespread crop failure and famine. The Minoan civilization, a society renowned for its elaborate palaces, vibrant frescoes, and complex trade networks, was dealt a blow from which it could not recover. Their central authority crumbled, their economy shattered, and their population scattered. Within a few generations, their written language, Linear A, was forgotten, and their memory faded into legend. The geological record tells a clear story, with a distinct layer of volcanic ash found across the entire eastern Mediterranean, a grim timestamp of the calamity. Many scholars now believe this real-world cataclysm, the sudden disappearance of a sophisticated seafaring culture, formed the core of the story we know today as the legend of Atlantis, a powerful empire lost beneath the waves. The Minoan silence is a stark reminder that the ground beneath our feet is never truly still. But volcanoes do not only erase civilizations with fire and water, sometimes they simply stop time, preserving a city in a tragic, perfect snapshot. While the Minoans were lost to legend, another Roman-era tragedy was preserved with heartbreaking clarity. On an August morning in the year 79, the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum went about their daily routines completely unaware of the cataclysm gathering above them. The market stalls were open, bread was baking in communal ovens, and families gathered in homes adorned with vibrant frescoes. Then Mount Vesuvius tore itself apart. Pliny the Younger, watching from a safe distance across the bay, documented the terror in letters that have survived the centuries. He described a monstrous cloud of ash rising like a pine tree, blotting out the sun and plunging the world into an unnatural darkness. But the true killers were the pyroclastic flows, surging avalanches of superheated gas and volcanic debris that raced down the mountain at impossible speeds. These flows instantly carbonized organic matter in Herculaneum and buried Pompeii under many meters of hardened ash, sealing the cities in a toxic, airtight tomb. This was not a slow decay but a sudden, absolute termination. For nearly 1,700 years, these communities were utterly erased from the world's active memory, their stories silenced. Their rediscovery began in the 18th century, revealing a frozen moment in time. Archaeologists found the haunting voids left by decomposed bodies in the ash, which they filled with plaster to create casts of the victims in their final postures, a mother shielding her child, a man crouching in vain hope of safety. We can see the loaves of bread left in the oven, the coins on a shop counter, the detailed political graffiti on a wall. This preservation is what makes the loss so palpable. Vesuvius did not just destroy two cities, it encapsulated an entire cross-section of Roman civilization, only to hand it back to a future world that had long forgotten they ever existed. This kind of sudden geological violence is one way a culture vanishes, but a far slower and more insidious force can achieve the same end, 1 degree at a time. Even the most powerful empires are no match for a changing sky. In the fertile crescent of ancient Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire forged the world's first great empire, uniting city-states under a single rule and creating a legacy of law and administration. Their power was built on a foundation of grain, sustained by a sophisticated network of irrigation canals that channeled water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But around 2200 BCE, the rains began to fail. This was not a simple dry season, it was a mega-drought, a climatic shift so severe and prolonged that it lasted for centuries. Sediment cores drilled from the bottom of the Gulf of Oman tell a silent, devastating story. They reveal a distinct layer of fine, wind-blown dust that dates precisely to the empire's collapse, dust that could only have come from the dry, exposed fields of a parched Mesopotamia. The intricate irrigation systems, the empire's greatest strength, began to deliver only dust. Crop yields plummeted, leading to widespread famine. How does a centralized state survive when it can no longer feed its people? It cannot. The social contract shattered. The outlying regions, once bound to the capital by trade and tribute, were abandoned as people fled in search of water. The great cities, centers of commerce and culture, were left to the encroaching sand. Archaeologists find evidence of this sudden abandonment everywhere, a layer of sterile silt covering what was once a thriving urban center. Experts like Harvey Weiss link this catastrophe to a global climate event known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, a period of abrupt cooling and aridity that stressed civilizations from the Indus Valley to ancient Egypt. The Akkadians did not fall to a foreign army. They were defeated by an invisible, relentless enemy, the shifting climate itself. This story of a civilization brought low by a changing world is not unique. It is a pattern that repeats across the globe, sometimes with an even more dramatic and chilling finality. Deep within the lush rainforests of Central America, the great stone cities of the Maya fell silent. The grand plazas where crowds once gathered, the towering pyramids that scraped the sky, and the ornate palaces that housed royalty were all gradually reclaimed by the relentless jungle. For centuries, this disappearance was one of history's greatest enigmas. How could such a sophisticated civilization, with its advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and writing, simply vanish? The answer lies not in a single cataclysm, but in a perfect storm of pressures that tore their society apart. At the heart of the classic Maya collapse between the 8th and 9th centuries was a profound environmental crisis. Paleoclimatologists studying sediment cores from nearby lakes and analyzing ancient tree rings have uncovered a terrifying truth. The region was gripped by a series of devastating mega-droughts. These were not mere dry spells, they were periods of extreme aridity that could last for decades, crippling the cultivation of maize, the absolute cornerstone of the Maya diet and culture. Imagine the slow, creeping dread as reservoir levels dropped, as springs dried up, and as the once reliable rains failed season after season. This environmental stress was amplified by the Mayas' own actions. To create plaster for their monumental architecture and to clear land for agriculture, they engaged in widespread deforestation. This deforestation likely reduced the region's capacity to recycle moisture back into the atmosphere, creating a feedback loop that made the droughts even worse. Famine and scarcity began to erode the very foundation of Maya society. The ruling class, the divine kings who were believed to communicate with the gods and ensure the rains would come, saw their authority shattered. Why would the people continue to support a king who could no longer deliver prosperity from the heavens? The stone stelae, those tall, carved monuments that recorded the deeds and lineages of the rulers, tell a chilling story. The inscriptions simply stop, the final dates are carved, and then there is only silence. It suggests a rapid, systemic breakdown of royal authority and the complex social order that depended on it. Competition for dwindling resources like water and fertile land likely ignited intense warfare between once allied city-states, further fragmenting their political world. The collapse was not the end of the Maya people, but it was the catastrophic end of their classic urban civilization. Their story is a powerful lesson in how environmental stress can exploit and exacerbate every existing crack in a society, causing a remarkably advanced culture to fragment from within. This internal unraveling stands in stark contrast to our next event, where the end came not from within, but from a storm of outside invaders. The silent ruins of the Indus Valley tell a story not of fire and brimstone, but of a slow, quiet unraveling. This was a civilization of remarkable planning and order, with cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa laid out on precise grids, complete with the world's first sophisticated urban sanitation systems. Around 1900 BCE, this meticulously organized world began to fade. The great cities, once bustling centers of craft and trade, showed clear signs of distress. Archaeologists find that the standardized weights and measures, a hallmark of their complex economy, began to vary. The fine seals they used for long-distance trade with Mesopotamia started to disappear from the archaeological record. Most tellingly, the drains and public buildings, once so carefully maintained, fell into disrepair. This was not a sudden invasion or a single volcanic explosion, but a civilization losing its grip. Primary culprit appears to have been a profound environmental shift. The lifeblood of the Indus Valley was the great river system, fed by reliable monsoon rains. But climate data from ocean sediments and ancient riverbeds suggests the monsoons began to weaken and shift course. The great rivers that watered their fields, possibly the mythical Saraswati among them, started to dry up or change their paths, turning fertile farmlands into barren scrub. Imagine the slow, creeping crisis for the farmers. watching their water sources vanish over generations. This environmental pressure was likely compounded by the arrival of nomadic pastoralists from the north, groups who moved with their herds and were adapted to a more mobile lifestyle. These were not necessarily destructive conquerors, but their presence added a new social strain to a system already under immense stress. The response was not a dramatic battle, but a gradual migration. People simply began to leave the grand, failing cities. They moved to smaller, more sustainable villages, adopting simpler ways of life. In this process of de-urbanization, something precious was lost forever: their written language. The mysterious Indus script, found on thousands of seals and artifacts, has never been deciphered because the cultural continuity needed to understand it was broken. A whole civilization's history, its stories, its laws, and its knowledge faded into silence, not with a bang, but with a slow, collective sigh. This quiet dissolution stands in stark contrast to the fiery, deliberate destruction that would later consume a legendary city of bronze. The sea itself turned against the shore. When the volcano at Thera collapsed into the sea, it did not simply erupt. It displaced an unimaginable volume of water, generating tsunamis that radiated outward like a shockwave. These were not ordinary waves. They were colossal, fast-moving walls of water, perhaps as high as a 10-story building, that slammed into coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean. For coastal communities from Crete to Anatolia, and even as far as the shores of the Levant, it was an apocalypse delivered by the ocean. Entire fishing villages and busy port cities, their economies and very existence tied to the sea, were simply scoured from the map in an instant. The archaeological evidence for this is written in the soil, not with pottery or tools, but with geology. Scientists drilling into coastal plains have found distinct sediment layers filled with chaotic mixtures of seashells, marine microfossils, and sand that was violently tossed far inland, a clear and chilling signature of catastrophic wave action. This was more than a local tragedy. It was a systemic shock to the entire Bronze Age world. The intricate trade networks of the time, which carried everything from rare metals to luxury goods across the sea, relied on these now destroyed ports. With the maritime infrastructure shattered, the flow of essential resources like tin for bronze weaponry and tools was severed. This single geological event, hundreds of miles away, delivered a crippling blow to powerful empires. It contributed to the decline of the Minoans by devastating their naval power and coastal farmlands, and it likely destabilized the Hittites inland by disrupting their vital trade links. The event shows us that a cataclysm in one place can send ripples of collapse across an entire interconnected region, a theme that echoes through history as we examine even wider systemic failures. The Hittite Empire commanded Anatolia with a mastery of iron and diplomacy, yet it vanished into a historical void. This was not a slow decline but a sudden, systemic failure. At the peak of their power, the Hittites controlled vast territories through a network of vassal states and a powerful army, whose chariots were the terror of the battlefield. Their capital, Hattusa, was a formidable fortress city protected by immense walls and stocked with grain in colossal silos. Then, around 1200 BCE, everything fell apart. Cuneiform tablets from neighboring empires like Egypt and the city-state of Ugarit paint a picture of sheer panic. They speak of mysterious invaders they called the Sea Peoples, moving in great, desperate fleets, attacking coastlines and uprooting societies. These were not a single army but a chaotic mix of migrating tribes, likely displaced themselves by the same widespread drought and famine that was crippling the Hittite heartland. Imagine the scene at Hattusa. The grain stores, once a symbol of imperial foresight, are depleted by years of poor harvests. The central authority, stretched thin by the effort to feed its people, can no longer control its outlying territories. And then the final blow lands. Archaeological evidence shows Hattusa was not conquered in a long siege but was looted and burned, then deliberately abandoned. The Hittites themselves set their own capital ablaze, a final, dramatic act of surrender. Why would they do such a thing? It suggests a complete breakdown, a realization that the system could no longer be defended. With the capital gone, the entire imperial structure dissolved. Their unique language, their religious practices, their advanced knowledge of ironworking, all of it was scattered and lost, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists millennia later. The Hittite collapse is a textbook example of a perfect storm, where internal strain and external invasion converge to erase a superpower from the map. It proves that even the most organized empires are fragile when multiple crises strike at once. This earthly turmoil stands in stark contrast to our next event, a disaster that literally fell from the sky. A cosmic winter descended without warning. Just as Earth was emerging from the last ice age, a sudden, violent reversal plunged the northern hemisphere back into deep freeze for over 1,000 years. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, began around 12,800 years ago with shocking speed, a climatic U-turn that scientists are still striving to fully explain. One compelling and controversial theory points to the sky. The hypothesis suggests that a comet or asteroid entering our atmosphere broke apart into multiple fragments that exploded in a series of immense airbursts over North America, or perhaps even struck the ice sheet itself. The evidence for this cosmic intervention is written in a thin, dark layer of soil found at archaeological sites across the continent. Researchers have discovered microscopic nanodiamonds, which form under immense pressure and heat, alongside tiny spherules of melted rock that could only have been created at temperatures far exceeding those of any wildfire. This is the debris of an extraterrestrial impact. The immediate consequences would have been apocalyptic. The blasts would have ignited continent-spanning wildfires, incinerating forests and grasslands. The soot and dust thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked the sun, triggering that rapid and severe global cooling. For the people living through it, the Clovis culture, it would have seemed like the end of the world. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers known for their distinctive stone spear points. Their world was one rich with massive prey, mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths. But in the aftermath of the proposed impact, this megafauna vanished, and the Clovis culture, with its specialized hunting techniques, faded from the archaeological record. They did not disappear entirely, but their way of life, finely tuned to a specific environment, was rendered obsolete overnight. The debate around the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains fierce within the scientific community, with some researchers pointing to other potential causes for the cooling. Yet, the possibility stands as a stark reminder that our planet's history and the fate of its inhabitants can be violently rewritten by forces from beyond our world. It challenges the very notion of a stable Earth, suggesting that our ancestors may have witnessed a cataclysm of truly cosmic proportions. From this celestial threat, we now turn to a disaster that was entirely of this world, yet just as effective at erasing a civilization from memory. The magnificent city of Petra was carved not just from rock, but from the very flow of water and wealth. The Nabateans were masters of the desert, an ingenious civilization that built a sprawling trade empire on the back of the lucrative incense routes. Their capital, with its breathtaking facades hewn directly into rose-red cliffs, was a marvel of hydraulic engineering. They constructed an intricate network of dams, cisterns, and channels designed to capture every precious drop of rainwater that fell in the arid landscape. This system allowed a bustling city of tens of thousands to flourish in the heart of a desert. but their mastery over water could not save them from a slow, gathering drought. The Roman Empire's annexation of the Nabatean kingdom in 106 CE was not a violent end, but it began a process of economic strangulation. The Romans shifted the main trade routes to the sea, bypassing the overland caravans that were the lifeblood of Petra. The demand for frankincense and myrrh, the sense of ancient worship and status, began to wane. As the trade income dwindled, the Nabateans faced a second, more relentless enemy, a prolonged period of aridity that settled over the region. Their sophisticated water systems, designed for seasonal rains, could not compensate for a climate that was becoming permanently drier. The reservoirs began to empty, the agricultural terraces failed, and the pressure to leave grew with each passing year. The abandonment was not sudden. It was a quiet, heartbreaking exodus. Families packed what they could and drifted away from the magnificent stone city, seeking sustenance elsewhere. Over generations, the grand tombs and temples were left to the wind and the sand. The Nabatean language, a unique script that was the precursor to written Arabic, fell out of use. Their distinct cultural identity, once so powerful, was gradually absorbed and diluted by the surrounding Byzantine and later Islamic cultures. They did not vanish in a flash of fire or a wave of invasion. They faded like a footprint in a desert storm. The silence of Petra is a testament to a different kind of cataclysm, one of economic irrelevance and environmental exhaustion. This slow erosion stands in stark opposition to the violent, definitive end that awaited a powerful civilization in the South Pacific. The great citadels of the Mycenaeans burned, their massive stone walls offering no protection from the chaos within. Around 1200 BCE, the palaces that had been the administrative hearts of this legendary Greek civilization, places like Mycenae and Pylos, were violently destroyed and abandoned. This was not an isolated incident but part of the great unraveling of the late Bronze Age world. The final moments of these palaces are recorded in a desperate, bureaucratic script. The linear B clay tablets, baked hard by the very fires that consumed the archives, do not speak of poetry or myths. They are inventory lists, records of military preparations, and allocations of bronze to armorers. They depict a society battening down the hatches, preparing for a siege that it would ultimately lose. Archaeologists find clear evidence of this violent end in distinct destruction layers, strata of ash and collapsed masonry that seal the fate of these powerful centers. In the wake of this collapse, something profound was lost forever. The knowledge of their written language, Linear B, used solely for palace accounting, disappeared from history, not to be deciphered again for over 3,000 years. The fall of the Mycenaean palatial system plunged Greece into a centuries-long dark age. The population plummeted, long-distance trade vanished, and sophisticated skills like fresco painting and monumental stone construction were utterly forgotten. People retreated to small, isolated villages, and the grand stories of the Trojan War and heroic kings like Agamemnon survived only as faint echoes in an oral tradition, later to be written down by a different Greek people who had no memory of the civilization that inspired them. The Mycenaean collapse demonstrates a terrifying domino effect, where the failure of one node in a vast, interconnected network can trigger a regional dark age, erasing not just a government but the very tools of its memory. This pattern of a dark age following a systemic collapse is not unique to the Mediterranean, as a similar shadow fell across the Andes, where a mighty empire simply dissolved into silence. The silent Moai of Easter Island stand as stone sentinels over their own creator's demise. On one of the most isolated pieces of land on Earth, the Rapa Nui people built a complex society, capable of quarrying, transporting, and erecting these colossal statues, some weighing over 80 tons. Their civilization thrived for centuries on an island that was once covered in a lush palm forest, but the very act of honoring their ancestors may have sealed their fate. To move the massive moe, researchers believe the islanders used a great quantity of logs as rollers and levers. With each new statue, the forest shrank. This was not a sudden decision but a slow, generational creep of resource exploitation. The consequences were catastrophic and irreversible. Without trees, the soil, once held firm by roots, washed away into the sea, crippling agriculture. Without large trees, they could no longer build the sturdy, ocean-going canoes that were essential for fishing deep waters and for maintaining contact with the wider world. The islanders were trapped, their protein sources dwindling, their fields failing. Archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of this societal breakdown. Analysis of ancient trash heaps shows a dramatic shift in diet, from dolphin and tuna to small inshore fish, and eventually to bird bones and even human bones, a chilling signal of famine and desperation. The oral traditions of the Rapa Nui, passed down through generations, speak of a descent into clan warfare and even cannibalism. The same society that cooperated to raise giants from the earth fractured into violent conflict over the last scraps of food and usable timber. The population, which may have peaked in the tens of thousands, collapsed to just a few thousand by the time European explorers arrived. Their story is a haunting, microcosmic lesson in the limits of an ecosystem. A civilization, no matter how spiritually or artistically advanced, cannot outlast the destruction of its own environmental foundation. This self-inflicted collapse from within presents a starkly different tragedy from our next event, where an invisible, imported killer wiped out millions. Across the Mississippi River, a city larger than London was already a ghost. Cahokia flourished for centuries, a sprawling metropolis of perhaps 20,000 people, centered around a grand plaza and dominated by the colossal Monk's Mound, a vast earthen pyramid that still stands today. This was the heart of a powerful Mississippian culture, a hub of trade and ceremony whose influence stretched across much of North America. Then, by the 1400s, the city was completely abandoned. The great wooden structures atop the mounds rotted away, and the bustling plazas fell silent. What could cause such a vibrant society to simply walk away from its monumental heart? The answer lies in a slow-motion environmental crisis. Recent studies of the soil tell a story of climatic whiplash. Core samples reveal layers of fine silt deposited by massive, recurring floods from the Mississippi River. Imagine the chaos as the river, their source of life and transport, repeatedly burst its banks, inundating the low-lying residential areas and the crucial bottomland fields where they grew their corn. This period of intense rainfall was followed by stretches of drought, a 1-2 punch that crippled their agricultural base. To build their city and to fuel the fires for their daily life, the Cahokians had cleared the surrounding forest. This deforestation likely made the flooding worse, as there were no longer extensive root systems to absorb the excess water and hold the soil in place. How does a society feed itself when its fields are either underwater or parched, and its resources are stretched to the breaking point? Social and political structures, likely centered on a powerful chief who was responsible for the community's well-being, would have buckled under this strain. The very ceremonies that once united the people, held on the summits of those great mounds, would have lost their power if the leaders could no longer ensure rain or prevent floods. There was no single invasion, no dramatic explosion. The people simply dispersed over generations, migrating to form smaller, more sustainable villages elsewhere. They left behind the magnificent earthworks as their only testament, a silent city of grass and soil where a complex civilization, with its unique political and religious life, was quietly erased from the memory of the continent. The story of Cahokia is a powerful American parable of a society undone by the very environment it sought to master. This pattern of a New World civilization succumbing to ecological pressures finds a chilling parallel further south, where an entire mountain empire was shattered by an unseen force. High in the thin air of the Andes, the Tiwanaku Empire perfected a way of life in a landscape that seemed to defy human settlement. For centuries, their capital near the shores of Lake Titicaca was a marvel of engineering and social organization, a bustling city of grand stone monuments and a unique agricultural system that turned the harsh Altiplano into a breadbasket. They built vast, raised fields known as suca collas, intricate grids of elevated planting platforms separated by canals. This was genius in its simplicity. The water in the canals absorbed the fierce sunlight by day, releasing the heat by night to protect crops from frost, while the muck from the canals provided a continuous source of fertile fertilizer. This system fed a populous, stratified society capable of erecting the monumental gateway of the sun and creating textiles of breathtaking complexity. Then, around 1000 CE, the rains began to fail. The empire's entire existence was predicated on a delicate hydrological balance, and that balance was shattered. Ice cores drilled from nearby glaciers, those frozen archives of ancient climate, tell an unambiguous story of a prolonged and severe mega-drought that gripped the region for decades. The intricate network of suca collas, so dependent on consistent rainfall and groundwater levels, began to desiccate. The protective canals dried up, leaving the crops exposed to killing frosts. The fertile muck turned to dust. How does a civilization survive when its technological masterpiece becomes its tomb? It cannot. Famine and social unrest would have been inevitable. The central authority, likely a priesthood or elite class that derived its power from ensuring agricultural abundance, saw its legitimacy evaporate as the fields failed. The great city was gradually abandoned, its people dispersing into smaller, more mobile groups in search of sustenance. Their cultural memory, their architectural techniques, and their distinctive artistic styles faded into obscurity, so completely forgotten that when the Inca Empire rose to power centuries later, they regarded the ruins of Tiwanaku as a sacred but mysterious place built by gods, not by their own human predecessors. The silence of Tiwanaku is a profound lesson in the limits of human ingenuity when confronted with a shifting climate. While this highland empire withered from a lack of water, other civilizations would be erased by its overwhelming, destructive force from the sea. The stone faces of Angkor Wat gaze out over a landscape of vanished genius. The Khmer Empire built a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, a vast network of canals, reservoirs, and moats that transformed the Cambodian jungle into a fertile plain capable of supporting a population of perhaps 1 million people. At its heart was the West Barre, a massive artificial reservoir stretching over 5 miles long, a testament to their absolute control over water. This system was the empire's lifeblood, enabling multiple rice harvests per year and supporting the staggering labor force that constructed the world's largest religious monument. Their civilization was a symphony of water and stone, but the climate began to change the tune. Paleoclimatologists studying ancient tree rings from the region have uncovered a terrifying pattern, a series of intense, alternating droughts and monsoons that struck in the 14th and 15th centuries. The droughts would have left the great reservoirs perilously low, while the subsequent extreme downpours delivered a second, more insidious blow. They washed enormous quantities of silt from the deforested hills into the canals and reservoirs, relentlessly choking the intricate waterways. The very system designed to manage water was now failing under its erratic behavior. How does a city survive when its engineered veins are clogged and its heart is starved? Recent LiDAR surveys, which use lasers to see through the dense forest canopy, have revealed the true scale of the crisis. They show an urban sprawl of astonishing complexity, with temples, roads, and dwellings stretching far beyond the central monuments. This sprawling city was entirely dependent on that fragile water grid. As the system faltered, the outlying districts farthest from the main reservoirs would have been the first to suffer. Famine and disease likely spread, undermining the divine authority of the god-kings who ruled from Anchor. Their power was intrinsically linked to their ability to provide water and prosperity. When the monsoons failed and the canals filled with mud, that sacred contract was broken. The great capital was not sacked by an enemy army, but gradually, heartbreakingly, abandoned over generations. The court moved to new riverine capitals near modern Phnom Penh, and the magnificent stone city of Angkor was left to the relentless embrace of the jungle. Entire libraries of religious and historical texts, written on perishable palm leaves, rotted away in the humidity. The Khmer Empire's story is a profound lesson in the vulnerability of even the most advanced infrastructure. Their engineering marvel, a source of immense power for centuries, became their greatest liability when the environmental conditions it was built for simply vanished. This reliance on a single, complex system raises a haunting question about the nature of societal resilience itself. Their story began with a promise of green pastures. Norse settlers from Iceland, led by the fiery Eric the Red, established 2 thriving colonies on the coast of Greenland around 985 CE. For over 400 years, these communities persisted, building stone churches, raising cattle, and trading prized walrus ivory with mainland Europe. They were the westernmost edge of the medieval world, a European society living on the doorstep of North America. Then they vanished. By the mid-15th century, the settlements were silent, their inhabitants gone without a clear record of their final days. The culprit was not a sudden invasion or a single disaster, but a slow, chilling squeeze. The climate itself was turning against them. A period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age was setting in, and its effects were felt most acutely in the fragile, marginal lands of the North Atlantic. The growing seasons became heartbreakingly short, and the sea ice around Greenland thickened and lingered for longer each year. This ice did more than just kill their crops, it severed their lifeline. The trade ships from Norway, which brought essential supplies like iron, timber, and grain, could no longer reliably navigate the treacherous, ice-choked routes. The Norse found themselves utterly alone, trapped in a world that was growing colder and hungrier by the decade. Archaeological digs at their final homesteads tell a grim story of a society in its death throes. The bones found in their garbage heaps show clear signs of malnutrition and increasing butchery of their valuable livestock, a desperate act that only sealed their fate by eliminating their future breeding stock. Perhaps the most tragic clue to their downfall lies in what they refused to do. The Norse were surrounded by the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, who were masters of Arctic survival. The Inuit hunted ringed seals through the winter ice and harpooned whales from nimble kayaks, skills perfectly adapted to the changing environment. Yet the Norse colonists, bound by a deep-seated cultural conservatism, largely refused to learn these techniques. They clung to their identity as European farmers and pastoralists, trying to eke out a living from pastures that could no longer support their cows and goats. They starved within sight of a sea teeming with life they did not know how to catch. Their disappearance erased Europe's first tentative foothold in the Americas, a lost chapter that might have changed the course of history. The Greenland Norse stand as a haunting lesson in the limits of resilience. It was not the cold itself that killed them, but their inability to change their way of life when the old ways were no longer viable. In the face of a shifting world, their greatest strength, their cultural stubbornness, became their fatal flaw. This failure to adapt to a new environmental reality finds a stark and violent contrast in our next event, where a civilization did not fade away in isolation, but was systematically dismantled by an overwhelming force. 16 massive stone heads stare from the jungle, their features weathered but their gaze still imperious. These sculptures are the most iconic legacy of the Olmec, the so-called mother culture of Mesoamerica. Their society, which flourished in the swampy lowlands of the Mexican Gulf Coast, was the first in the region to build large ceremonial centers, develop a complex calendar, and perhaps even invent a form of writing. Yet by around 400 BCE, their great centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta were being systematically and ritually destroyed, not by invaders but by the Olmec themselves. Monuments were defaced and buried in long, orderly rows. This was not a random act of violence but a deliberate closing ceremony, a quiet surrender to forces that were slowly choking their world. The primary pressure was environmental. The Olmec heartland was a land of rivers, and their agriculture depended on the predictable flooding of these waterways to enrich the soil. But the landscape was dynamic and unstable. Evidence from sediment cores suggests that the course of the Quetzalcoatl's river system, their lifeline, began to shift significantly. What was once fertile floodplain may have become a malarial swamp or, in other areas, a parched field. At the same time, volcanic activity in the distant highlands spewed layers of abrasive ash over their lands, further damaging crops and possibly contaminating water sources. How does a civilization respond when the land itself turns against it? The Olmec response was not to fight to the last person, but to disperse. Their population gradually migrated away from the old centers, carrying their knowledge and traditions with them into new territories. This is why their disappearance feels so different. There was no single cataclysm, no final battle. Instead, their cultural DNA was absorbed and transformed by the rising societies that followed, most notably the Maya. The Olmec mastery of jade working, their ball game, their concepts of deity and kingship, all became foundational elements for every subsequent Mesoamerican civilization. The mother culture did not die, it simply faded into the fabric of its children, its distinct identity lost in the process of giving birth to a wider world. This slow cultural blending offers a profound contrast to the model of violent erasure, reminding us that a civilization can vanish not through destruction, but through its own successful dissemination. A vast empire unraveled in a single lifetime. The Inca, masters of a territory stretching thousands of miles down the Andes, commanded an army of millions and built citadels like Machu Picchu that defied gravity itself. Yet this monumental civilization was brought to its knees not by a rival empire, but by an invisible weapon it could never have anticipated. European diseases, particularly smallpox, raced ahead of the Spanish conquistadors, traveling along indigenous trade routes faster than any human messenger. The virus found a population with no natural immunity, a tinderbox of biological vulnerability. The result was a demographic catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. Entire villages were wiped out, and the intricate social order that held the empire together began to fray. The ultimate blow came when smallpox claimed the life of the Sopa Inca, the Emperor Huayna Capac, and his designated heir around 1527. This single event triggered a brutal civil war between two remaining sons, Atahualpa and Huascar, fracturing the empire at the very moment it needed unity most. When Francisco Pizarro and his small band of 168 men arrived in 1532, they did not encounter a unified state, but a realm freshly torn apart by conflict and decimated by plague. Pizarro's subsequent capture of Atahualpa, despite being overwhelmingly outnumbered, was an act of audacity that exploited this profound internal weakness. The Spanish cannons, steel swords, and horses were terrifyingly effective, but they were merely the final, violent shock to a system already in systemic failure. The true erasure of Inca civilization came in the aftermath. The Spanish methodically dismantled the imperial structure, targeting the very mechanisms of Inca memory. The quipu, a complex system of knotted cords used for record-keeping, accounting, and possibly even chronicling history, was banned and destroyed by the colonial authorities. Without the quipu masters to interpret them, these records fell silent, their stories permanently locked away. The great temples were torn down, and their stones were used to build Catholic churches directly on top of the sacred foundations. The state-mandated labor system that built the empire was repurposed for Spanish mines, draining the population of its strength. Within a few generations, the collective knowledge of Inca stonemasons, astronomers, and administrators was scattered and lost, their language suppressed, and their cultural practices driven underground. The conquest of the Inca stands as a stark lesson in the role of chance. Had smallpox not arrived first, or had the line of succession remained clear, the story of the Andes might have been one of resistance and negotiation, not of near-total erasure. It was the tragic convergence of biological catastrophe and human ambition that sealed the fate of a civilization, leaving its magnificent stones as silent witnesses to a world that was deliberately forgotten. A different kind of silence fell over the Indus Valley. The great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, marvels of ancient urban planning with their straight streets and advanced drainage, did not burn or crumble under siege. Instead, they slowly emptied as if the lifeblood of the civilization was simply draining away. Around 1900 BCE, the people began to leave. This was not a sudden flight, but a generational migration, a quiet retreat from urban complexity back to a simpler, rural existence. The primary driver was a profound environmental shift. The life-giving Gaga-Hakra river system, possibly the mythical Saraswati River mentioned in later texts, began to fail. Monsoon patterns shifted, and the great river that watered their fields and filled their baths and wells gradually dried up, turning fertile plains into arid scrubland. Without a reliable water source for their intensive agriculture, the agricultural surplus that supported the city dwellers, the artisans, and the administrators simply vanished. You can see this decline written in the archaeological layers. The standardized weights and measures that once facilitated a vast trade network from Mesopotamia to the interior begin to show variation, a sign that centralized economic control was slipping. The finely carved seals used to mark goods for long-distance trade become rarer and then disappear entirely from the record. The workshops that produced exquisite beads and pottery show less specialization, their craft slowly reverting to household production. As trade collapsed and cities lost their economic reason for being, the most profound loss occurred: their written language. The mysterious Indus Valley script, found on thousands of seals and artifacts, was no longer being taught or used. With the dispersal of the educated scribe class and the breakdown of the institutions that required record-keeping, the knowledge of how to read and write it was lost within a generation or two. The 400-plus symbols of their script remain an unbroken code to this day, a silent testament to a complete cultural rupture. The Harappan civilization did not end in fire and sword, it dissolved. Its people carried on, and some of their cultural elements, like motifs and technologies, likely persisted in the smaller villages that followed. But the urban experiment itself, one of the world's first and most sophisticated, was erased from human memory until archaeologists began to piece its story together millennia later. This quiet unraveling stands in stark contrast to a final, far more intimate kind of erasure, one that strikes not at a city or an empire, but at the very soul of a people. Their brilliant ceramics captured a world of gods and warriors, yet they could not preserve their own. The Moche civilization flourished along the arid coast of Peru, building monumental adobe pyramids like the Huaca del Sol, a structure that once rose like a man-made mountain from the desert plain. Their society was a marvel of adaptation, sustained by intricate irrigation canals that channeled water from the Andes to create fertile valleys in one of the world's driest places. But around 600 CE, the climate itself turned against them. The periodic El Niño phenomenon, a warming of Pacific Ocean waters, intensified into a series of monstrous events that lasted not for months but for decades. The first phase brought biblical rains to the desert. The normally dry riverbeds, known as quebradas, swelled into raging torrents that smashed through their carefully engineered canals and drowned their fields under meters of mud and debris. How do you rebuild an agricultural system when your very blueprint for survival has been washed away? The Moche tried, but then the pendulum swung the other way. The same climatic forces that brought the floods ushered in a prolonged and severe drought. The rivers they depended on dwindled to a trickle, and their reservoirs sat empty under a relentless sun. This 1-2 punch of too much water followed by not enough was a recipe for societal collapse. The archaeological record at the Huaca del Sol tells a grim story of this final unraveling. A large section of the Great Pyramid shows evidence of deliberate, systematic dismantling. This was not the work of an external enemy, but of an internal rebellion, a people turning against their rulers who had failed to appease the gods and control the elements. The elite, who derived their power from their perceived connection to the divine, saw their authority shattered by hunger and despair. In the wake of this collapse, the Moche's distinct cultural identity began to fade. Their vibrant artistic tradition, with its famous portrait vessels depicting individual faces with startling realism, ceased to be produced. Their religious ceremonies, centered on coastal temples, were abandoned. The vacuum they left was gradually filled by the expanding Wari culture from the highlands, which absorbed the scattered Moche population and overwrote their traditions. The Moche did not vanish overnight, but their unique place in history was erased, their story buried under desert sand until archaeologists unearthed it millennia later. Their fate is a powerful lesson in how a society, no matter how well adapted to its normal environment, can be broken by climatic extremes that push its systems beyond their limits. It forces a haunting question about our own world, where such oscillations are becoming more frequent and intense. How resilient are we when the weather itself becomes the enemy? The entire Eastern Mediterranean world fractured in a single generation. Around 1200 BCE, a contagion of collapse spread from the palaces of Mycenaean Greece to the fortress cities of the Hittites and the wealthy ports of the Levant. This was the late Bronze Age general systems collapse, a perfect storm where multiple crises fed upon one another with devastating efficiency. It began with a foundation of environmental stress. Tree ring and sediment core data reveal a period of severe, prolonged drought that crippled agricultural production from Anatolia to Mesopotamia. Famine stalked the land, weakening populations and straining the treasuries of kings who could no longer collect grain as tax. Then the earthquakes came. Geological evidence suggests a spike in seismic activity along major fault lines, toppling the very walls that were meant to keep people safe. Into this chaos rode the so-called Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of migrants and pirates displaced from their own homelands, perhaps by these same climatic disasters. Egyptian temple reliefs at Medinet Habu depict a desperate, swirling naval battle against these invaders, showing their distinctive feathered headdresses and their families traveling in ox carts by land. They were not a unified army but a symptom of the wider disintegration, a wave of human desperation crashing upon the shores of already fragile states. The true death blow was the shattering of international trade. The complex, interdependent economy of the late Bronze Age was its greatest achievement and its ultimate vulnerability. Copper from Cyprus was smelted with tin from Afghanistan to make bronze weapons for the armies of Egypt and the Hittites. This globalized network, recorded in cuneiform tablets found at sites like Ugarit, was the lifeblood of empires. But as piracy made the seas impassable and cities fell, these routes evaporated. One poignant clay letter from the burning ruins of Ugarit pleads for help from a neighboring king, stating, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. The letter was never sent." The loss of this connectivity triggered a catastrophic domino effect. Palaces that had once employed scribes, artisans, and soldiers could no longer pay them. The specialized knowledge of writing, monumental architecture, and complex bureaucracy was no longer funded or valued. Across the region, literacy vanished. The Linear B script of the Mycenaeans, the cuneiform of the Hittites, and the Cypro-Minoan script of Cyprus all fell into complete obscurity, not to be read again for centuries. This was more than a political change. It was a cognitive collapse, a descent into a dark age where the very tools for remembering a complex society were themselves forgotten. The great kingdoms did not just fall, they were systematically erased from the record, their achievements becoming the stuff of later myth and fragmentary memory. This ancient system's collapse holds up a distant mirror to our own interconnected world, asking a silent, urgent question about the true strength of the threads that bind us all together. Having journeyed through these 20 stories of collapse, certain haunting patterns begin to emerge. These civilizations were not erased by random misfortune alone. Time and again, we see a fatal convergence of environmental pressures and societal rigidity. A changing climate, whether a mega-drought or a volcanic winter, acted as the trigger. But the outcome was always determined by the society's capacity to adapt. The Greenland Norse starved because they clung to an outdated identity. The Maya kings lost their power when their divine promises of rain failed. The intricate, energy-hungry systems of the Bronze Age world shattered when their flow of resources was cut. The common thread is not the specific disaster, but the inability to change course in the face of it. What does this tell us about our own place in history? Our global civilization is the most complex and interconnected the world has ever seen. We too face environmental shifts, resource pressures, and deep-seated institutional inertia. The silent cities and forgotten scripts we have explored are not just relics. They are a collection of choices, a chorus of warnings from the past, urging us to build a world that is not just grand but resilient, a society that remembers how to change before it is too late to remember anything at all. From volcanic eruptions to climate shifts, these 20 cataclysmic events reveal a sobering truth. Civilizations rise and fall at the mercy of nature and their own choices. We have walked through the dust of silent cities, from the Minoan silenced by Thera to the Maya fractured by drought, from the Greenland Norse frozen in their ways to the Inca shattered by invisible germs. A clear pattern emerges time and again. Environmental stress, whether a sudden earthquake or a creeping change in the monsoon, acts as the trigger, but the true collapse unfolds when a society proves too fragile, too rigid, or too complex to adapt. The most profound loss is not of stone and mortar, but of knowledge itself, the forgotten languages, the silenced stories, the erased memories that leave only riddles for us to solve. These stories are far more than historical curiosities. They are a collection of urgent lessons on sustainability, resilience, and the critical importance of preserving our collective memory. As we face our own global challenges, from a changing climate to resource pressures, these forgotten civilizations offer a stark mirror. They urge us to build a world that is not just technologically advanced, but deeply adaptable, one that values flexibility over rigidity and remembers how to change before it is too late to remember anything at all. Thank you for joining this exploration into humanity's forgotten echoes. If this journey into the past resonated with you, subscribe for more and share your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these vanished worlds speaks most powerfully to you today?